welcome you all to this session on integrating human rights into the future of biodiversity action. Human rights has been an important set of issues as we continue to discuss the Global Biodiversity Framework. But first, I want to invite you all to just close your eyes for a minute. Close your eyes. Those of you who are here in person and have been sitting in discussions and negotiating, striking out of text and in brackets, and those of you who have been joining us online, following the negotiations, or living in your communities and working in your communities. On this session, as you have your eyes closed and your mind settled, we really want to truly imagine humanity's relationship with nature. And we want to do that through an exploration of human rights and biodiversity. That doesn't necessarily have brackets or commas or words. And think about that as we embark on this discussion. This discussion will build on the recognition of rights to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment as a human right, and by the Human Rights Council Resolution 4813, which really shares the ideas of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that really is focusing on the issues of promoting rights, a rights-based approach to protection of biodiversity, including key issues such as participation and making sure environments like this are as inclusive as possible, transparency, accountable implementation that safeguards Indigenous peoples' rights and ways of life. We will hear today from several discussants on recent research that has come from the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights that's focusing on integrating human rights into national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and rights-based approaches to conservation finance will be presented to inform this interactive session. But I beg you all and ask you all to maintain this thought of reimagine. We don't always have to do things the way we know how to do it. We need to challenge ourselves. We need to listen to those communities closest to the ground. We need to evaluate where we sit in the world and how we engage with the environment. So again, the charge here is reimagine. And in that reimagine, how do we integrate human rights into the future of biodiversity action? So I'm going to turn to my first speaker, Georgina Vargas, who is going to speak to us about work that they've been doing on human rights-based approaches to biodiversity action and finance. Georgina, are you ready to go? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and also good morning and good evening to everyone on site and online. It's a real pleasure to me to open this side event with a briefing on the report entitled A Human Rights-Based Approach to Biodiversity Conservation. I would like to say that this report is still a work in progress, and it's being carried out by Leah Temper from the McGill University and the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, myself, Georgina Catacora Vargas from the Academic Peasant Unit Tiahuanaco of the Bolivian Catholic University, and Agruco, a research center on agroecology with support and guidance from the Environment and Climate Change Unit of the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. Well, as the title of this report suggests, its purpose is to reflect, but also propose on elements to move from biodiversity action that excludes people to biodiversity action that considers them from the perspective of human rights holders. Based on this, I would like to share that when we are talking about human rights-based approach, we are referring to the design and implementation of policies and programs that are based on principles and standards that are derived from the international human rights law. And this with the goal of reducing inequities and to move towards and to achieve freedom, justice, and peace, as it is stated in the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So from this perspective, focusing on the marginalized and disadvantaged groups for different reasons, either geography, poverty, gender, disability, or others, is very central. Now, considering all these elements and thinking on biodiversity, the human rights-based approach to biodiversity refers to the promotion and realization of this freedom, justice, and peace building through decision-making, planning, and actions that conserve biodiversity, that contribute to uses sustainably, and to the fair and equitable share of benefits arising from the utilization of biodiversity and genetic resources. So we are talking about the three objectives of the CBD. And this in a way that fosters integral welfare in favor of right holders. And when we are talking about right holders, we are referring of those whose livelihoods directly depend on biodiversity. Therefore, when there are challenges to access and use biodiversity, or biodiversity is deteriorated, those livelihoods are the ones who are more jeopardized and face different challenges in their human rights realizations. Accordingly, examples of right holders are indigenous peoples, peasants, artisanal fishers, pastoralists, herders, subsistence hunters, gatherers, and within these groups, women, youth, elders, and children. Now, we have heard in different side events and many experts indicating that the promotion, respect, and implementation of human rights is a legal obligation. And this obligation also applies to biodiversity action. And besides this legal obligation, also there are elements that are very important for policy making that inspire to apply a human rights-based approach. And those are, I'm not going to go in depth in this because I think it has been also addressed in other events, and is the interdependence between biodiversity and human well-being. Also, in many cases, it has been reported that conservation strategies that exclude people also are related to challenges to human rights realization. And also there is evidence that biodiversity that is conserved and sustainably used by right holders, particularly indigenous peoples, is quite effective. So considering these points, the current version of the report, A Human Rights-Based Approach to Biodiversity Conservation, is organized under the following topics. First, we have an introductory section on the relevance and the overall context of the current trend of merging the biodiversity and the climate change agendas and the potential implication on human rights. Next, please. Then it addresses a review, it makes a review of historical and emergent human rights challenges that are associated with conservation paradigms, from classical and exclusionary conservation approaches to the newer market-based approaches where we have, for instance, biodiversity offsets. The next, please. Payments for ecosystem services, including initiatives on REDD, and others that are increasingly described as nature-based solutions. Next, please. Well, the previous section on the challenges, it addresses the implications of these exclusionary approaches and the challenges that imposes on different rights. And we focus mostly on the right to own property, cultural rights, participation and self-determination, equity, and the right to development, which are at the same time related to many other civil and political rights, as well as socioeconomic, cultural rights. So the report also includes different elements on how we could how we could approach human rights based in relation to biodiversity. So the report addresses different and considers different international instruments relevant to the implementation of human rights, starting from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948, but also other instruments. And in total, we consider 15 instruments that jointly address a variety of rights within civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights, also the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and the right to development. And finally, the report provides examples on how we could put in place a human rights-based approach to biodiversity as a transformative path. So the key messages from this, and we can go to the next, thank you. The preliminary key messages is that both classical exclusionary biodiversity conservation and market-related based approaches, included the new versions as those self-defined as nature-based solutions, hold risks, a significant risk and challenges for human rights realization. A second key message is that there is extensive human rights law that imposes obligation on duty bearers to respect, promote, and implement human rights in biodiversity action. And a third key message is that the human rights-based approach to conservation of biodiversity is transformative in itself, and it has all the potential to contribute to biodiversity conservation while ensuring health and well-being of people. So we believe that now that we are in this process of discussing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, also in the road towards COP15, we hope that the report can provide important elements, not only for this context that we are now, but also for broader goals, such as achieving the right to development, sustainable development, of course, and the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and others that are relevant for the well-being of people and ecosystems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgina. And I think that this research helps us, right? It helps us think about, one, what's not working, what has to change, how do we draw on international instruments that are there and actually use them. And I think the important thing is, where do we see transformation? We have the opportunity now, as we're sitting in these meetings, to look at how we make those tweaks to the agenda. But I think where do we, once we move to implementation, is where do we transform on the ground? How do governments, institutions, et cetera, make that transformation? So I want to shift our next presentation to Therese Armisen? Okay, sorry. A human rights officer on environment and climate change on the Office of the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. And she is going to take us down a level, right, and look at the integration of human rights into national biodiversity strategies and action plans.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, and I'm very pleased to be here to present what we call a working draft of the UN Human Rights Office's report entitled Integrating Human Rights in National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. At the outset, I really want to recognize the work, the research, analysis, writing done by Clarisse Wambua at the outset for this report. I think Clarisse maybe is with us online today, so it's really her work that I'm presenting and that we're taking forward in these discussions and consultations. Just as a little bit of a scene setting, I really want to refer to the adoption of Human Rights Council Resolution 48/13 in October last year, which recognized the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and really provided a momentum for the integration of human rights, including the right to a healthy environment, in the development and the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I'm not going to repeat anything of what Nina has said just before me, just a little bit more what we want to say about the human rights-based approach to biodiversity. It really is a tool. It's a tool that's normatively based, as Nina mentioned, on international human rights law and standards, and it's really operationally directed to promote and protect human rights. And in our setting today, the human rights-based approach really helps promote the sustainability of biodiversity action, empowering people, especially the most marginalized, and Nina mentioned some of those peoples and groups that may be in vulnerable situations, and to participate in policy formulation and to hold accountable those who have a duty to act. And finally, again, the setting, NBSAPs are really the principal planning tool for the parties to the convention. It offers, therefore, a unique opportunity for human rights to be included in the foundations of biodiversity conservation and management. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our report. Very self-explanatory title, Integrating Human Rights in National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. We set out to provide guidance to states and other stakeholders on how to plan for and implement really rights-based biodiversity action. And in our report, we do that. First of all, we outline the interlinkages between human rights and biodiversity, really explaining how biodiversity is necessary for the enjoyment of human rights and how the realization of human rights is beneficial for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And for example, in turn, biodiversity loss can result in human rights violations and thereby exacerbate existing inequalities. We try to explain why integrating human rights in biodiversity planning is essential, both for biodiversity conservation and management to be successful. It enables human rights-based action to enhance the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and it allows also the protection of human rights and the action undertaken to do so to benefit both people and planet. Nina also alluded to the fact that really allowing the synergies between biodiversity and human rights to be better understood and to be enhanced also assists to play a role in the transformation that's also required to attain the SDGs, for example. And finally, really what we like to enhance and really cannot underscore enough, the human rights-based approach to NBSAPs really specifically ensures that biodiversity is protected in a non-discriminatory, inclusive and participatory manner. The report aims, as I say, to provide guidance to state and other stakeholders, specifically on how this can be done. How can human rights considerations be incorporated into biodiversity planning? And again, our findings and really our belief and our key message here is that this is best done when human rights are really explicitly integrated in explicit terms in the language of rights and the corresponding obligations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We're sharing some examples of how this has been done so far. The basis of our report is an analysis of 186 NBSAPs from state parties, and it looks at both direct and indirect references to human rights, and it includes also the specific considerations that have been given to groups and persons in vulnerable situations. Next slide, please. Some of our main findings really is that rather few states make it explicit or really direct references to human rights. The majority of NBSAPs, they factor in human rights related issues and use indirect references, maybe to related principles, related concepts. And really, as a whole, NBSAPs, as it stands today, as this analysis was undertaken some months ago, it really fails to adequately integrate human rights as it is in biodiversity policymaking and planning. I'll share some examples, some of our findings, as some of them are positive and enlightening. 44% of the NBSAPs do directly refer to at least one human right. And 83% of them have taken into consideration persons, groups, and peoples in vulnerable situations. 69% refer to local communities. For example, the NBSAP of Ethiopia does so. 24% reference Indigenous Peoples. Australia's NBSAP does so. 49% reference women, such as the NBSAP of Nigeria. And youth and children are referenced in respectively 22 and 24% of the NBSAPs. Bahamas reference youth, and Azerbaijan, for example, specifically refer to children. Then the right to a healthy environment is the right that is most frequently referenced. It appears in 15% of NBSAPs, for example, in those of Liberia, Mongolia, Nicaragua, Norway, and Turkey. And 28% of the NBSAPs have indirect references to the right to health environment. And I'll talk a little bit more about the indirect references in a moment. Basically, what we find the implications of incorporating the right to health environment in NBSAPs would be to further strengthen with an in-depth exploration and elaboration in the NBSAPs of what this right means, what it means for the country, what it means in the context of biodiversity, and how this can be attained. We have a few good practices in terms of really specifically directly incorporating substantive rights. Guatemala's NBSAP directly affirms the state's commitment to guaranteeing the right to life. And Switzerland's NBSAP provides that it's important to protect biodiversity, as this guarantees certain rights, including those to clean air and water. The indirect references, some of them come in the context of references to domestic laws and policies or court decisions. Indonesia's NBSAP, for example, referenced the right to culture through cross-referencing domestic law that contains elements guaranteeing that specific right. The NBSAPs of Sao Tome and Principe reference the country's constitution that safeguards the right to housing. And India's NBSAP referenced the right to education and does so by referencing a domestic law that provides for action plans in the education sector. More on the procedural part, in terms of procedural rights, 7% of NBSAPs directly reference the right to access information, and 7% directly references the right to participation. Only 2% of NBSAPs reference the right to access legal remedies. So based on this analysis, we have a few recommendations to make, leaning on sort of what both Nina and I have said at the outset about the human rights-based approach. So first and foremost, we really recommend NBSAPs to expressly articulate in human rights language the entitlements of rights holders and the obligations of duty bearers. And states, as the primary duty bearers, should really incorporate their human rights obligations in NBSAPs, both in terms of procedural rights, as I mentioned, facilitating public participation, access to information, access to justice, and in terms of substantive rights. We already mentioned some of them: the right to life, the right to health environment, the right to culture, right to food and health, adequate housing, self-determination, importantly, and as well as the right to safe drinking water and an adequate standard of living. Very importantly, as I said at the outset, the whole process of developing NBSAPs should be participatory. And we also think that there is room and there should be a way for states as the primary duty bearers to set out at the outset, when they set out the human rights obligations, also to address responsibilities of businesses related to biodiversity loss and the related human rights harms. Finally, NBSAPs should also incorporate effective human rights monitoring, reporting and accountability mechanisms, and this should be implemented and maintained throughout the lifespan of the policies. Remembering that NBSAPs, they're not an end in themselves, they're just the beginning of a long-term process of participatory biodiversity planning and action, and that their implementation should really be a process of continuous dialogue with rights holders. Concluding, again, we're proposing this guidance aiming at informing parties to preparing their NBSAPs following the adoption of the post-2020 GBF. As the parties to the CBD and the global community overall really seek through the post-2020 GBF to stop biodiversity loss, it's key to recognize the interdependence of human rights and our environment, the importance of realizing the right to a healthy, clean and sustainable environment for everyone, and again, rights-based biodiversity action, it is necessary in order to effectively protect both people and planet. Integrating human rights in the development, content, and implementation of NBSAPs is really a crucial policy tool to this end. I want to conclude by also referring to another product guidance that we have developed at the Human Rights Office together with our partners at UNEP. We have developed a set of key messages on human rights and biodiversity, which provides further policy guidance for rights-based biodiversity action, and they're available on our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Therese, and thank you. I think it's really important, the articulation really as a tool, right? That human rights-based approach as a tool to achieving our efforts. And I think outlining what is really in the NBSAPs gives us all fodder to look at how we're working as governments and as NGOs and as communities on these issues and keep governments accountable. And I think the issues around procedural and substantive rights are key to moving those things forward. I want to take now to turn, we've sort of heard, we've set the stage for the why. I think we want to look at the how and how do we keep building on those momentums or the experiences that others have had with a human rights-based approach. I'm first going to turn to David Cooper, Deputy Executive Director of the CBD. I know he's got a tight agenda, so he gets to go first. So I'm going to pass the word for you and some reflections on the research that's been done.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and good day to everyone. And thanks also to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and all of the partners here for bringing us together to consider the opportunities to address human rights in the context of biodiversity action and implementation of the Convention, especially as we now develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And thanks to Georgina and Therese for introducing these important reports, which I think are going to be really useful as we finalize that post-2020 plan and perhaps even more so in implementing it. There's been an interest on the rights, the perspective of rights holders in the Convention, of course, in particular with the Convention's Article 8J and the focus on traditional knowledge and the role and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And more recently, we've seen this rights holders approach broaden with more consideration of gender, the rights of women and girls, of youth, and so on. And I think this increase in interest in a human rights approach, in human rights-based approaches, can help to ensure the comprehensiveness that we'll need to have the transformative change that we'll need to achieve the goals and targets of the post-2020 framework and through the implementation of the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Certainly, the landmark resolution 4813 of the Human Rights Council recognizing the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment as a human right comes at a very timely moment and perhaps can give some impetus to the discussions. And I think for the CBD, this is important not only for the development of the post-2020 framework, also now we're discussing here the gender plan of action. And of course, on the basis of the work done in the working group on Article 8J, COP will be recommending the further development of the programme of work on Indigenous peoples and local communities, which will also be vital in promoting a rights-based approach in the implementation of the post-2020 framework. And I think more broadly, we're seeing issues of social justice, of a need to address inequalities as coming to the fore in these discussions, not only in the CBD, but in the Climate Convention on desertification and so on. And these issues have been highlighted in the IPBES Global Assessment, in the latest IPCC report that came out recently. You'll see in the first draft of the post-2020 framework that there is a reference to rights-based approaches, the need for recognition of gender equality, women's empowerment, youth, and of course, the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities. We know and we hear from those communities how important this will be for particular targets, such as that on protected areas. I'm sure that reports we've heard will help us there. Several of the targets also address many aspects of this right to a clean environment, right? Clean water, clean air, blue and green spaces, and so on. So I know we're short of time. I think I just would like to thank all the organizers here for your research, for your activities on the ground, for your advocacy. I think the reports that we've heard and the key messages are going to be extremely useful as we go forward. And I'd like to, thank you all for your unfortunately have to leave, but I'm sure you're going to have a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Much appreciated. I'm going to turn now to Nori Ignacio. She's the director of the Southeast Asian Regional Initiatives for Community Empowerment. And I would love to hear from her perspective the importance of these issues. And I think David has outlined well the trend that has been in the context of the discussions within the CBD and where things are currently landing. He talked about the importance of rights holders. It's been broadening in the context of the convention. Now we're seeing the draft of the GBF have those references, and targets are mentioning the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So coming from a community perspective, what does this mean to you, or what has been your experience in the context of the work you do? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, good evening to all watching online. It is with much appreciation that Nina mentioned peasants in her presentation as one of those who suffer and continue to suffer due to biodiversity loss. The small farmer, regardless of whether he or she belongs to an indigenous group or a local community, regardless of whether the small farmer is a woman or a child, has continuously been ignored and marginalized. The text of the Convention on Biological Diversity itself does not specifically contain the word farmer or peasant. In 2013, efforts were made to include the small farmers to belong in the nomenclature local communities under Article 8J of the Convention. That's why we now have what we call the IPLCs. However, lumping the farmer with all those belong to local communities made the farmer invisible and marginalized. Despite having maintained biodiversity for thousands of years, farmers, pastoralists, and peasants continue to be marginalized, if not invisible in the CBD, because it seems like farmers are not considered as rights holders, but as duty bearers. Farmers are required or are imposed the duty to till the soil and produce food so that all the world's population will be able to enjoy the right to food, the right not to be hungry. Farmers have the duty to engage in ecosystems-based agricultural approaches so that they can continue to produce food without any harm to the environment. And for thousands of years, before the last century, farmers have resorted to sustainable agricultural practices that led to everybody else's enjoyment of the right to clean air and clean water, the right to a balanced and healthy ecology, the right to a sustainable environment. The sad reality is that even as farmers have the rights, there is no venue for farmers to enforce their rights, particularly their rights to seed. There is no existing system of liability and redress by which farmers can enforce their rights to seed. It is very ironic that the farmer seed systems that maintain seed biodiversity are not protected by any law in most cases, but laws are in place to protect the proprietary rights of businesses over seeds. Farmers' rights and biodiversity conservation are so intimately intertwined and interrelated that one cannot exist without the other. I hope that this discussion, this side event, will contribute to ensuring that farmers' rights, as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas, particularly the rights to seed, will be part of integrating the human rights-based approach to the NBSAPs and the CBD as a whole. For instance, farmers' rights should be at the core of all negotiations around global governance for DSI and the basis for the design of any access and benefit sharing mechanisms. With all the challenges that farmers are facing now, the only way they can continue sustaining biodiversity is when their rights are protected and upheld. And so we urge parties to the convention to walk the talk and genuinely recognize and protect farmers' rights in all biodiversity actions, because farmers' rights are human rights too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nori. And I think you've brought to light why we're talking about these issues and recognizing a community that isn't often talked about as much at this level and that needs to be. And I think that's extremely important. And we constantly have to raise those level of voices and awareness across all the work that is done among governments, organizations, and communities. I want to turn now to Timo Mufeti, Environmental Commissioner of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry and Tourism in Namibia, to hear their perspectives, reflections on their own process, and thoughts about your MBSEPs as well in these issues. So I will pass it to you, Timo.
Thank you very much, Christine, for the opportunity and for all the colleagues. But let me also show appreciation to the Commission for the good work they are doing around the world, and specifically at this meeting when we want to advocate for human rights, to make sure that they are properly addressed there in the Global Biodiversity Framework that we are discussing on the goals and targets, which is very, very good. We have seen some good suggestions, which I think parties will be able to pick it up and implement the practical stuff. So thank you so much. I think it will be very, very helpful. For us and for people who are in government, these issues are real. They are the issue we face every day on how do you balance biodiversity conservation and human rights. And many times you experience those conflicts. And this type of tools, this type of practical example on how to maneuver or go around it will really, really help us. We have got tools at the national levels, we have got institutions, we have got documents, we have got policies, we have got even constitutional level, which we talk about. People should be coming first, but on practice, on ground, when you have got communities affected by protected areas or standing up, and the capacity that is needed to be built, not only on the government side, but also on the community side, people who are affected. Those are the real issues, and for Namibia, this is what we are advocating or pushing to make sure that some of these principles are really taken up in the framework. And our people, as the previous speaker said, those farmers, people out there, people there with the resources, they really depend on what we do as government, as international organizations, to preserve, to uphold their rights. And we are looking forward for those suggestions to be put in practice, because that is what is really going to help government, different institutions, people with the regulatory authority to make sure that it's a law, it's up there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Timo. And I think the comment, and I think what we're hearing is the issues are real, right? They're real whether you're in a community and your rights are being violated. They're real whether you're an organization and you're trying to figure out your role and how to make sure that you uphold rights and support rights in the work. But they're also real for governments. As Timo said, many governments have, their constitution has lots of rights issues, but maybe not always has the capacity to deliver on those things. And I think that's something that we constantly need to remind ourselves, but also what is the pathway forward among all of these pieces. I now want to turn to Pernilla Malmer, who's the senior advisor and member of the Swedish delegation, who has been a big proponent of the human rights framework in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Sorry, got my frameworks in, twice. But I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on what we've heard so far, but also the work that you all are doing as well.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all who have come here, as well as the panel who has been so inspiring so far. Actually, listen to you, but also in particular to the discussion in the plenaries and contact groups going on now. It is like we have reached the tipping point for the recognition of a human rights-based approach. I think it's like you also said when you presented the work you did on the MBSAP, that sometimes also when you are not really saying human rights-based approach, there are implementation that you do that is in line with that. And if you see the language and proposal from parties now in terms of Indigenous people's rights, the gender equality, the gender responsiveness, I think we have really come a long way forward. And what this depends on, maybe, it is the IPBES global assessment that recognizes the better standard in terms of conservation of Indigenous peoples' territories than other areas. We also actually have the local biodiversity outlooks that the IIFB and other partners have compiled together and that have been showing things. But I also think actually that the implementation of the latest 10 years have really recognized the importance of Indigenous peoples, local communities, women, youth, and so on. And this also can make us, I mean, what we need now is very much the concrete examples, and that is why you, for example, see in different plans what has been done. We can also see what is gaps, like we saw, for example, that it was few that have the access to justice in the implementation, which is also, of course, I mean, beside the participation, the real heroes of implementation is the environmental human rights defenders, which are standing up and protecting biodiversity. The draft gender plan of action, which we also have on the discussion now, is quite a good example of how to implement the human rights-based approach. And if we will have this implemented through the targets, it will also be kind of a guidance of how to have it done, not only for women and girls, but of course also for people in all their diversity, and give agency of people to work together to the convention. Then also to note that what we really need to make this happen is, of course, a very strong monitoring framework that take us up all and really see that this is happening in the NBSAPs. And maybe also we could start to work on guidance on how to do it. But I think we have so much good examples already with this work starting here. For example, the report from that we just have got presented now from Human Rights Office and so on. So thank you very much. We look forward to continue this now.
Thank you, Pernilla. So I think it's important to highlight, as you did, and we started off, we've come a long way. We have better standards, we have more examples, and we're seeing this manifest itself within the context of the convention. But there's always more that we can do, and how do we really get the guidance there, but also those cases and experiences on the ground and the learning across. I now want to turn to Maria Jesus Ovalle, who's the CBD national focal point for the Ministry of the Environment for Chile, to hear about the context of Chile, the experience they have, and obviously you've just had a change in government and what that may mean for the future as well.
Thanks, Kristen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation and for giving us in this side event the chance to reimagine humanity's relationship with nature by exploring the linkages between human rights and biodiversity. Very special thanks to Georgina and Therese for their insightful interventions, and to the previous speaker for the essential points they have raised. I will focus on the human rights-based approach to biodiversity by sharing with you some thoughts and national instruments aligned with it. As mentioned in the presentation of Georgina and Theresa, this approach promotes freedom, justice, and peace building. In this sense, I'm thrilled to announce that we are strengthening these aspects in Chile, particularly by sending the Escazú Agreement to our Congress for adherence this week. For us, there is only one environmental agenda: climate change, degradation, biodiversity loss, pollution must be addressed all together because they are all interlinked. If we don't adopt the integrated approach, no successful outcome will result from our efforts. At the same time, there is no single unique magical solution. Instead, the action must be integrated, coordinated, based on evidence, and designed to fulfill the needs of the people in the territories, especially those in vulnerable situations. We believe that some ecosystems can be no-tech protected areas, such as the one on the high seas, though many others which have citizens living on it, especially IPLCs, should balance protection and sustainable use measures. In our country, we have some instruments aligned with this. Their purpose is to conserve while IPLCs maintain their livelihoods and traditional knowledge. So I would like to share briefly 3 examples of these instruments. The first one are the marine and protected coastal areas of multiple use. They are classified according to IUCN as Category 6, which means that they aim to protect natural ecosystems while conserving associated cultural values and sustainably using their natural resources. The second example in Chile are the benthic resources management and exploitation areas. This is an access regime that assigns exclusive exploitation rights to organization of artisanal fishermen, though through a management and exploitation plan based on the conservation of these benthic resources in some delimited geographic sectors. The third example I want to share are the indigenous coastal marine space. They are delimited marine areas whose administration is handed over to indigenous communities or association of them that have exercised a customary use verified by our National Indigenous Development Corporation. Finally, I want to highlight that we are towards the approval of a living process. Adopting a human rights-based approach and adding it to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework are not just some pretty words on a paper to later be forgotten. On the contrary, this approach, alongside gender equality, participation, access to information, and justice, are crossing-cutting issues that we need to constantly mainstream throughout the society, with all our commitment and willingness to set us on the path to live in harmony with nature by 2050. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And it's good to hear that the Escazú Agreement is in the Chilean Congress right now. I know that many in Latin America and around the world have been waiting for that. And I think it's very much appreciated that you're highlighting the examples of Chile here. And I think we look forward and can hear, based on your comments, the movement of Chile in terms of integrating the issues of a human rights-based approach more broadly. In our final discussion, I'd like to go back to the experience of communities. And I always think it's important that we go back to those experiences in this conversation. And I want to go to Daniel Koibe, who's the director of the Okiak Peoples Development Program, to hear from his experiences related to a human rights-based approach. What have been the challenges, what has been progress, and what do you see are still as gaps based on what you've heard here?
Thank you very much. I think, being among the last speakers, let me thank the people who came up with the report and all the partners. And when we talk about the role of indigenous peoples and the issues of biodiversity, one thing which we don't seem to discuss more is about we are revolving around land and territories. And when we talk about land and territories and right-based approaches, one of the challenges indigenous people face is conflict with conservation. When they are saying this is our ancestral home, our government says this is a protected area. So they want it to protect, but us, we want to be custodians. We want to take it so that it can be used by everybody. So our environmental defenders have faced a lot of challenges because they are always being arrested
threatened because they say they have gone against conservation. But in real sense, as we discuss what we are doing here, we should think about how are we going to devolve all that we are doing in these big conferences and to these communities on the ground. Because the conflicts which are there, the challenges they are facing, is some of them are related to biodiversity. And when we talk about budgets, do we talk about budgets going to these communities? Or we talk about budgets going to national budgets? So let's discuss, as we discuss and we talk about rights, we see how are these people being threatened because of that. Another point is about litigation. Indigenous people are facing a lot of litigation because of their land and territories. When they are fighting and saying, we want our lands to protect and take care of it. Now there is already issues about 30 by 30. And then you tell them, yeah, what is 30 by 30? These are things which are coming up, but they are not consulted. But we come about this in this place and say, we are going to do 30 by 30. Are you going to take what I have to be 30? Or are you going to add me 30? Or are you going to enhance the 30? Because all these are terminologies and it affects us, but we say nothing about us without us. So we should be saying, how are we going to make some of these right-based approaches to reach us and become part and parcel of it? Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I think it's important that you, I don't want to say spoke last, but you did, our discussants. And I think it's important to note that we've had the research that has been done by the Human Rights Commission. We have the resolution. We have the tools. It has recognized the gaps. And I think we've heard of the progress that has been made in the context of the CBD negotiations and then on the ground. But I think you highlight very importantly that there are still issues, and it's not a perfect scenario by any means. The issues around evolving land and territories, that there still exists a conflict between peoples and conservation. And I think the issues around the budgets going to communities, the issues around financing, and I know Indigenous peoples and local communities are pushing that agenda, and it's an important agenda regarding where does the financial resources go to actually do that. And I think the other point you made around protection and custodians is a very important conversation and discussion to be had in this process. We actually do have some time, which I didn't think we would. I want to open up to the people here in the room and those online. If there's a couple of key questions, we could probably take around 3 or 4, depending on the length of the question before we have to close the event. Do we have any questions online that have emerged? Maybe I'll go to the online group first. Oh, only congratulations. Oh, that's not a bad thing. Any questions in the room or comments? Over here? And can you identify yourself too, just so we know?
Thank you. This is Rashid Titumir from Bangladesh. Thank you, Justin Walker, for an excellent moderation. And particularly, I was provoked in terms of when you say reimagining the relationship between nature and human being. I had a very particular and specific question. When the first presenter makes 2 points, one is nature as an asset class. What does she say about it? Because this is a very serious issue that has been grappled by everyone, and we didn't hear any kind of definition of it. So that's a serious, I'm sure I have not really read the report, but if you are really looking at that nature as an asset class, meaning that plan to create a market in nature itself are fraught with danger and biodiversity offsetting payment for ecosystems could allow the fate of our forests, rivers, meadows, wild species, and the other into really a problem. And this comes from the idea of colonial legacy, particularly in Anglophone countries, of their forest acts, which sees forest as a commercialized entity. And it would be good if you can really do a study, historical analysis, and to see that how this is a reincarnation of those colonial laws, either in Africa or in Asia. And secondly, it's also problematic in terms of understanding with the name of sugarcoating, valuing in the name of pricing nature. And I can go on, but I need to really see what the authors are trying to mean by nature as an asset class. And this is, if it is to do with Sir Parthodas Gupta, then it also really go back to what has been discussed in IPBS. So let's have a conversation on that. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is there any other questions in the room? Joji?
Thanks very much. I'd like to pose a question to the government of Chile. Given that these are good ways forward, in Chile, do you consider these protected areas, OECMs, or how do you categorize those examples that you have made? And do they relate at all to indigenous or local community territories?
Thank you. So I'll first go to Georgina, and then we'll go to Maria, and then we'll do another round.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that comment. Perhaps I didn't express myself well, but the report and the spirit of the report is in line of what you are saying, and to be very careful on placing biodiversity, its components and its functions in a monetary market, like as it functions different market-based approaches. Because we know, and it has been discussed, so-called nature and biodiversity, specifically in this context, has many values. Some of them are tangible and might be physical and might have different values, including economic, but this is not the only value that biodiversity, its components and functions have. We are also talking about these intangible and other values that go in the dimensions of being spiritual, symbolic, that are recognized also in the human rights law. So apologies if I was not clear on that respect, but the concerns that you have raised is also the concerns that we share, and for what we are advocating, a comprehensive implementation of human rights from the perspective and for the benefit of right holders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maria?
Thank you very much for your question. I'm not aware of all the details, but in my general understanding, the first one, the marine and coastal protected areas of multiple use, are considered as the same name as their name says, as protected areas. And there are few kind of uses that are allowed in order to not disrupt their ecological processes. On the other hand, the other two, the one related to indigenous people and to fisher local men, they are considered other effective conservative measures because the main objective is the use of the resources, but in a sustainable way. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. Oh, well.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So first, I had a comment. So indeed, many targets address human rights related issues, but we need to be aware that as long as these issues are not part of the monitoring framework, there will be no transparency as to human rights compliance or as to whether a human rights-based approach has been adopted or not at national level. And just a proposal would be to strengthen significantly more the references of human rights in NBSAPs through the streamlining of the NBSAPs. And so that would require a strengthening of Annex A of SBI Agenda Item 9. Oh, I didn't introduce myself, by the way. I'm Ioannis Agapakis from Client Earth. And then I had a question for Ms. Arnesen. And yeah, so this is related to whether there have been any discussions on whether the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Treaty system could include reporting on the adoption of a human rights-based approach in biodiversity governance, and to what extent you think that this would be feasible or even desirable? Thank you.
Mauricio?
Yeah, many thanks, Mauricio, with the Forest Peoples Program. Thanks so much to everybody. There were very, very useful presentations. And it's good to see that it covered from the global to the national to the local level. I fully agree that it will be critical to bring these issues in terms of implementation at the national level. So it's very good to see the work being done on MBSAPs, and fully agree with Daniel's comment that these issues need to be addressed at the very local level. However, my question is related also on the monitoring framework, and specifically on how the right to a healthy, clean, and sustainable environment could be more fully integrated in it. We all welcome it, but I agree with the previous person who had the question. I fully agree as well that unless it is integrated in the monitoring framework, there is no kind of obligation to report on it. And in discussions, both in the Indigenous Caucus and with environmental organizations in the past few days, one of the areas where we felt that it could be directly addressed is in Goal B, either as an additional milestone or an additional component with related component indicators. The problem, however, has been that there has been almost no time to discuss these issues. So for the parties, there has been little time. For us, there has been zero time. I'm wondering, and I'm asking maybe specifically the governments of Chile and Namibia who are here, whether they could help us to bring this to the table. For example, we have a specific language that could be proposed to have it centrally, to have it reflected in the monitoring framework. Thank you.
Great, and well played there, Mauricio. Any one last question we'll take up here, Viviana, and then we'll close the questions and allow for the answers.
See, thank you. Following Mauricio's idea, I think this afternoon that we will be discussing item 6 and also the EPSAs, which are in the sea, the ocean conservation. I think the examples that Chile has mentioned are very strong and very key to support Indigenous people and local communities and the work, their governance in their territory. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I'll leave it for our speakers to respond.
Do you want me to start? I can start by answering Client Earth on your question about the UPR. And if I got it right, how reporting on the inclusion of a human rights-based approach related to biodiversity could fit into the review. I think there's multiple ways of doing that because the review is based on different input, right? It's based on the national reports from states, from the state that's under review specifically. It's based on a report that's summarized by the UN, where the Secretariat here is servicing sort of that support function. And that again relies on, whatever review a state party has been subjected to, whatever submissions is made from UN country teams in the field, sort of official UN information. So, and thirdly, and maybe most importantly for you, the summary of stakeholder submission, which really is it is a summary, but it incorporates the information submitted by civil society stakeholders, both in the country and international ones, and also by national human rights institutions. So I think that leaves a lot of space to address those issues. Even also if submissions aren't fully reflected in those documents, they will still be loaded on the website. So the full submissions will be publicly available. You have sort of other advocacy opportunities as well related to the reviews, both in country and in Geneva, where civil society can raise these issues with other states, with embassies in country, or with the CSOs that are Geneva-based and work on sort of advocacy and awareness raising related to that review. So I think there's a good deal of opportunities for that. I think that from what we've seen, what we did at our end some time ago, we tried to do a review of how sort of climate change and environmental issues had been picked up in the UPR. And we think that we saw that there is an increasing trend of doing so. And I think all of that would be very much in line with, what our principles say, what our High Commissioner says, that really the triple planetary crisis overall is the biggest threat to human rights today. So I think there's plenty of room for that to be incorporated in there. Then we could go on about discussions about what rights are privileged in that review or not. But I think it's really up to all the stakeholders involved to put it there, to draw attention to it there. I hope that responds to your question. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to turn to Chile and Namibia in terms of the offer or request that has been put on the table, and love to hear your response.
And thank you very much. I think from Namibian point of view, we are very much open to look at some of the suggestions which are very specific that will help us to improve the languages or even addition to make it specific. And as we have said, yes, if we don't have these issues in the monitoring framework, for government will be very, very difficult to tie it. And we want to be tightened up to specific issues and aspects that is going to help us to make sure that we monitor, we implement. And please feel free to make those suggestions, and we look at it and discuss it. And not only on that one, but any other issues that might advance very well the human rights, so that we see them going and they're reflected very well into the goals, targets, and even milestones. That will help.
Thank you very much for the comments and the proposal. We agree that it's really important to have this set in the monetary framework, but we also agree there is no time left. For example, try to have something like this as a headline indicator would be almost impossible because there are too many parties that have to be aligned and we don't have time. So we can explore maybe to propose something as a component indicator. We will be happy if you share a specific proposal, because you must understand that these guidelines for our national position is quite new as the new government. So we're still wondering how is the best way and where is the best place to put these things. But I also want to highlight the importance to have this reflected on the MBSAPs and the updated SBSTTA. And there as well, all the efforts must be put to actually implement these things. Lastly, I want to comment the last thing that was mentioned regarding EPSAs. And we are in a national effort to align our protected areas and other base management tools with the EPSAs. And I know we see a lot of challenge on that, but the idea is to use the synergies and the scientific evidence to protect the places that are most needed to be protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I want to end this session just as we began. I'd like you all to sit back, move your eyes away from your screens. Those of you who are here, those of you who are online, close your eyes and think about what we heard in this session today. And most of you who are in the room or in our virtual room, these are the issues that you are working on a day-to-day basis. We know that the instruments are there for a human rights-based approach. We know that we have to really think about the way forward. Progress has been made, and we've seen that in the context of the CBD. But I think we need to make sure that things continue to move forward, and that an important comment was made that it needs to be part of the monitoring framework as well. So I want you all just to take in what you heard, think about those advances, but think about that there's still challenges on the ground. And how do we continue to work at a multi-scaled, multi-tiered approach to ensure that a human rights-based approach is in all aspects of the work that we do, not just at the talk at the global level, not just in the language of our constitutions, but actually in the actions and the relationships that people have with nature and people have with each other in trying to protect the planet. With that, I want to make sure that I thank all of our co-sponsors, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, Swede Bio, IUCN CESP, Forest Peoples Program, the ICCA Consortium, and Women for Biodiversity. So thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned for further engagements around this issue from the collaborators. Thank you very much.